All right, welcome to my presentation or talk. I'm going to be speaking about, well, the title is Speak Uncertainty with Confidence. And the subtitle I've added since I wrote the summary is How to Communicate Data Without Showing It. So, my name is Johnny. I call myself a data practitioner because it's so hard. Like the field of data, the roles, they're all kind of blurry. It's always like, what do you mean by data engineer? What do you mean by data scientist? I'm just like, I work with data. And yeah, welcome to this talk. I hope you're going to enjoy it. Is this going to work? Or do I have to point it. So I'm going to start by kind of presenting the key takeaways I want you to bring with you once we're done with this session. So, oh, I forgot I had to. No. So mainly two things. It's going to be that I want you to start thinking about like averages and maybe start questioning them. Like, what value do you get out of getting an average told to you? And secondly, I hope that you will start thinking about confidence intervals in a different way. They're actually quite useful. It's just that they have been kind of wrapped into this jargon of statistics and all. And I want to bring it back. So I hope you'll bring this with you afterwards. So let's get into it. Huh? So a little bit of context first. I've been working with data for like 7 years now. And I've learned during this time that technology, despite being hard sometimes, it's complicated, especially if you work on big scale and so on. But it's usually, when you want to get value out of your data, it's usually the organizational parts that are the hard parts. And why are we actually even working with data? What do we want to do? What value does it bring? Well, there are many ways you can use it, but in this talk, I'm going to be mainly focusing on, to support decisions with data. So you hear something and you update your decision based on like, okay, was it too much? Was it too little? I guess I should adapt my decision based on the data that I got. So we communicate data. The people that are making the decisions are not always the ones that are knowing the data from the start. So someone is collecting the data, and it comes in many shapes and forms. I'm mostly going to be focusing on numbers in this presentation. The issue is that we humans are quite bad at taking huge amounts of numbers. We just see a wall of numbers, and we're like, what am I going to do with this? So the way we usually communicate it is either mainly by using pictures, graphs, visualizations of data. But before we get to that, I want to talk something about distributions. Another mathy word. I promise there is not going to be any math, no pluses, additions, multiplications, any math formulas. But I just want to get into the concepts of math and statistics. And one of the main ones that are important for this talk is going to be distributions. It kind of says, where is the data? You have probably seen this one before, if you have worked with data before. It's the normal distribution, and it kind of shows where on the line at the bottom your data is. So the higher up the black line goes, the more prevalent that number is in your data. And specifically the normal distribution, you see that the numbers in the middle is more likely to happen, more occurring in your data compared to the numbers outside of it. And then we have another example of it. A more skewed one, doesn't matter which one, but it shows that the numbers on the left side are more more commonly occurring. So that's kind of the background, the foundational knowledge that I find important before we can move on to the actual meat of the presentation. The averages is the first part. It's quite a vague term. In statistics, you would call it a measure of central tendencies. Very pretentious sounding, but it just means that where is the data? And there are different ways of explaining where the data is. But before we get into that, I just want to talk about an example. This is going to be kind of the red thread throughout the whole presentation. So imagine you wake up one day and you want to go to work, but your car is broken. There's coming smoke out of it, and you don't know what to do. So you, one way or another, get it to the car repair shop and ask them, how much is it going to cost to repair this car, my car? And the mechanic might say, looking at the condition and what's going on, around 3,000. Okay. This number could be coming from their experience. They might think, yeah, I've seen this before, so I know about 3,000. Or they might be basing it on data. They know that cars that previously came, we have data, they tend to be around 3,000. But for you as the one who has to decide, I mean, obviously you still need to have a car, but you might want to go to another car repair shop. But how do you make that decision? There is a lot of ambiguity in that 3,000-ish. How sure are they of that number? Like, is it actually going to be 3,000? And how much can it differ? It might be trivial, and you might hand wave and say, oh, it's probably plus minus 1,000. And that might work. But if, let's say, you're limited in your budget, and you can actually only take an expense of 5,000, it's quite important to know, will it go over 5,000? Because then I might not be able to pay it. So, how do you evaluate this decision? And this kind of is the foundation for all the problems I'm going to bring up now. So, let's start out with, I'm going to go through the examples or the main issues I have with averages, starting with ambiguous meaning, and then later on moving on to unknown distribution, hidden uncertainty, and easily misinterpreted. So, what kind of averages? What is an average? Well, commonly there are three kinds of averages that we care about in daily life. We first have the median. Most of you might have heard of it. It's just the middle point of your data. If you just spread your data on a line, you take the middle point and say, this is my median. It's quite good. You have a 50-50 balance of all 50% of the data is underneath this value and 50% of the data is above it. And then we have the mode. You might not have heard this term, but it is equally easy to understand. It's just which number is the most common. Think of it as when you go vote. That's when you care about the mode. You care about who got the most votes. It doesn't matter what kind of votes, but you know that you want to have the most votes. Same for cars. The most common value. So the mechanic might have meant, oh, most cars that come in here cost 3,000 to repair. And lastly, and the most nebulous one, probably most common, is the mean. You probably already know how to calculate the mean. You just take all the numbers you have, sum them up, and divide them by the number of numbers you have. And that's easy. But what does it actually mean? How do you interpret that? It doesn't refer to any middle point in your data. It doesn't refer to any structure of your data. It's just a number that you've calculated. So, when the mechanic says about 3,000, which one is it? So, we have this ambiguous meaning. It's often not clear what they mean when they say it's about 3,000. And these are, it doesn't matter which one you mean, it's not always clear. And then, even if you were to know which one it is, then it doesn't matter if it's a normal distribution. In a normal distribution, we have the median, the median, and the mode all being the same. So then you're in luck if the price of the repair is a normally distributed value. But if it's not, then it can differ quite a bit, especially if it's skewed extremely to one side or another. Then the median will differ more and more from the mode and the mean. And this can make a big difference for your decision. And the fact about the distribution is actually quite more important than just knowing how skewed it is. it also says something about how much it can vary, which side is more likely to happen. So if I just keep forgetting this. So you just know, oh, the mean is 3,000. What do you know actually about the rest of the data or their experience? It could be any one of these. It could be that it's actually quite likely it's in the middle, or equally likely all of the values that might happen, or it just might be that 0 could be the most likely. It's just, they just need to hose it down with some water and it's fine. So you don't know that by just hearing about the average. It's hidden. So it's the unknown distribution. You don't know anything about what their data says or what their experience is. You only know one value. And even if you were to know the distribution, you don't know how widespread it is. Even with a normal distribution, you see it can be very close or it can be very wide. It can be any value between 100 and up to 10,000. And that matters when you want to make a decision about whether you should repair your car there. So it hides uncertainty too. And it gives this illusion of precision that you might feel comfort in. But it's a false sense of precision that makes it harder to make a good decision. All these three problems that I've mentioned so far have been more about like the fundamental issue with our averages. You cannot get the distribution from it. But this last one that I want to mention has to do with if you were to compare it. Let's say you do get value from like the estimate from two different car repair shops. One says 3,000 and one says 4,000. Okay, how do you compare that? Or rather, the mechanic says, in general, your type of car is going to be cheaper than the cars that come in that are of a different brand. An easy interpretation would then be, okay, does that mean that every time, let's say, make it more concrete, you have a Skoda, and a car comes in that is a BMW, and you think, oh, yeah, that BMW is probably going to cost even more to repair. But is that really true when you know that the average is higher for one of them? Actually not. It's just saying that on a group level, let's take the mean. You know that the mean is higher, but that just means that if you were to sum all the repairs for Skodas and all the repairs for BMW and split it on every single car, each individual car of BMW would be higher, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the specific BMW that just came into the repair shop is going to cost that much. You might think that's pretty trivial, right? Of course, it's not going to be that way. But that's kind of the same exact logic that people tend to apply when they think about like a statement like, people from group A are more likely, or on average, more likely to steal than people from group B. And then you start judging every person. Oh, okay, that's a person from group A. I should probably be careful, despite not knowing anything about that individual. So it's a common misinterpretation with averages. And they're easily misinterpreted. So I've gone through 4 issues I have with averages, and that doesn't mean that I'm saying that they're useless. They're still extremely useful when you're doing mathematics or when you're trying to calculate statistical values of something for some other purposes, let's say machine learning or something. But they're so commonly used in decision making or in research when you're trying to communicate the result of some research. They tend to say on average. And I find that lacking. So, what can you do? What can we replace it with? I'd argue that confidence intervals could be of a way. Because, yes, you cannot always communicate using a graph. In text, you have to give some kind of textual answer. And confidence intervals just adds a little bit more complexity to how to answer it, but I think in return you get so much more. But what is a confidence interval? You've maybe heard of it from statistics, where it sounds so complicated, where it's the mean plus minus some standard deviation, depending on what kind of distribution it is. But I want to bring it back. Like, it doesn't have to be that complicated. You probably already used it before by just saying, hey, the cost for the repair is going to be between 2,000 or 7,000. That's already an interval, at least. And you, as the customer, can then say, oh, okay, that's good to know. Then it can cost up to 7,000. That means that if I only have a budget of 5,000, I do know that there is a risk that it will cost more than that. But there is also a probability that it might cost less. But you might wonder, how sure is the mechanic about these numbers? So that's where you go from an interval to a confidence interval by saying, hey, I think that it's 90% sure. I'm 90% sure that it's going to be within this interval. Sounds a little bit pretentious, maybe, but it means that they believe that 90% of the cases it will land in between 2,000 and 7,000. You might have some questions about how this works, and I'll get to the ones that I think are the most obvious ones. But how do you communicate this? Okay, I've drawn a line and put some numbers on it. How do you communicate this in text instead of this graph? I haven't seen any standardized way of writing down an interval. So I just came up with something. This is quite simple. You just have brackets and say the upper and lower limits, and then maybe say even the percentage. So in this case, it would be 2,000 to 7,000 with a 90% confidence interval. That's all and good. But couldn't we improve it by just looking at this and wondering, how do you differentiate between these two using a confidence interval? Right now they look the same because they have the same values. Well, we can go back to the averages and add a median. Then you would know where the middle lies. So if you know that between 2,000 and 7,000, the median is 4,500, then you at least know that it's more centered. It's some kind of symmetrical value. It might not necessarily be that this is the most common value, but instead it could be that it's split up into two tops instead. But at least you know something about where the data is distributed without having to actually see the graph. The same for this skewed one. Then you know that a lot of the data is skewed towards being closer to 2,000. So when I need to decide whether I want to repair my car, can know, oh, okay, it's going to be between it's likely that it's going to be between 2,000 and 3,000. That's comforting to know if I have a limit. So to add to the notation, just add a middle number, and it's very clear. And once we start normalizing this, we don't actually have to mention the 90%. That's something I would argue for. But you might have some questions that I mentioned before. You might wonder, why not just give the 100% intervals? Why only give 90? Well, there are two main issues for this. The first one is that for intervals, you could technically always give negative infinity to positive infinity. That would cover every single value. That's a 100% interval. I could say that about everything. Oh, your car repair, it's going to be 0 to infinite. Okay, thank you. That doesn't help me at all. I know nothing. Okay, the median is maybe 10,000? I don't know. So, that's the first one. The second one is, even if you were to not be silly about it, even if you don't say infinity just because you're 5, it's still hard to give a 100% interval because then you have kind of locked yourself in to always being correct. You cannot, in a single instance, be wrong because then it wasn't actually a 100% interval. So, the mechanic would then have to say maybe 0 to 10,000. And that gives you way less information about what it could cost for you, because the 10,000 won or 100,000 won might be because the car had to be scrapped. You had to buy a new car. That is something I don't hope to have to do, but it's it could happen, and it's not very useful for me to know. So 90% interval is actually not using 100%, is actually a way of embedding more information about how sure we are. But no. Okay. But then you might ask, why 90% and not like, let's say, 80%? Well, this is more arbitrary. There is no true answer. In science, they usually use 95% to call it statistically significant. But for ordinary, like when you want to estimate something based on the experience, the difference between 95% and 90% is very hard to conceptualize. It's easier to think 1 in 10 rather than 1 in 20 of being wrong. And 80%, yeah, sure, that is easier to maybe estimate. It's 80, but it also means that you're going to be wrong 20% of the cases. So I suggest that 90% is on my own opinion, a good balance between being correct and uncertain. But then, how do we know that it's 90%? It's easy to just say, hey, my confidence interval is 90%. And here is, once again, something that needs to be normalized maybe. It's more about like a norm change, cultural change. Just like anything else, we have to practice this. This is something you can get better at. Research has shown that humans are intuitively pretty bad at statistics. And no fault of our own. We haven't practiced it. It's not something that you formally have to learn. And research has shown, though, that you can practice. You can get better at it. You can estimate. You can get better at estimating what your own 90% confidence interval is. It is something that is subjective and personal, because it all depends on what you know, unless you're describing your data. Then you just need to take the 90% confidence interval, because you already have the data. So, now that I've described the different parts of confidence intervals, how does it compare with averages? So I'm going to go through all 4 of the issues, and we'll see if they fix them in some sense. We have the ambiguous meaning. Before we had, it's about 3,000, but now instead we have 2,000 to 7,000, and 3,000 as the median. There is no really space anymore for misinterpretation, because there is only one version of it. There is no multiple versions of averages. Or there is multiple versions of averages, but not multiple versions of confidence intervals. You have one interval, and you have one median, and all of those are clear in what they mean. As for the unknown distribution, we kind of already solved it by adding the median, like I mentioned before. You know, when you see that 3,000 is closer to 2,000, that, yeah, it's probably skewed towards that side. Might not look exactly this way, but you have a feeling for the distribution at least. And confidence intervals make it very clear where your uncertainty lies. If we just assume that we all talk in 90% intervals, and I don't have to say that every time. When you say, hey, my estimate is between 4,500 and 7,000 with a median of 5,500, very long to say, but in writing it's probably easier to read. You directly show that you're pretty sure that it's going to be somewhere in here. While someone who is not as certain, if I, on my own, had to guess what my car is going to cost in repair, I might say 2,000 to 8,000, though maybe slightly higher because I think it's maybe a major problem with the car. So you immediately make it clear how uncertain you are by just saying how wide your interval is. It's all about what you think is 90% going to cover it. And you still, with a meaning that you might still be wrong 10% of the cases. And lastly, the interpretation, when you have 2 lines to compare, Here, you make it extremely clear that you cannot compare them just one-on-one. With the averages, you could just say, you could compare them, like 5,000 is actually lower than 6,000. But with an interval, that's not as clear. You have to state your purpose, what's your intention, what's important for you. What's important for me might be that I don't want it to exceed 7,000. Then you compare these two workshops and say, oh, one is 7,000, one is 8,000. Maybe that's better. Or you want to compare how likely, what is the most likely number? Then the upper one is maybe better because it has a lower median and lower median. So it's all about what you need from the confidence intervals. And all of these interpretations would then be correct. You don't have to worry about what it actually means because you can apply it directly to your case. So, then we have these four values. These four issues I have with averages that I think confidence intervals overcome pretty well. But what else can you do with confidence intervals? There are actually more benefits to it. You might think, hey, I could easily combine two averages, like 5,000 and 6,000. You can just combine them in for whatever reason, and then that average would be 11,000. How do you do that for confidence intervals? Or you might think, how do I compare them? If I would like to compare, how likely is it that the confidence interval is going to be between, if we go back, how likely is the lower confidence interval going to be between 3,000 and 4,000? I want to know because that's important to me. Or you want to know how likely is it that something outside or inside is going to happen. You can do specific numbers, and can you improve your summations? All of these things can be improved with simulations. It's a whole another field, and I would need another session to talk about that. But it's very interesting, and it's a field where you can start applying statistics to extract even more value from your data. And I would love to gush about it. So if you're interested or intrigued about it, don't hesitate to come up and talk with me. But we've kind of reached the end here. I just want to repeat my key takeaways again and see if you agree with me. I hope that I've raised awareness about where averages are lacking. I hope you, next time when you hear an average, you might ask them, can you give me an interval instead? Especially if they have the data. Instead of summarizing the data into an average, ask for an interval instead. And just embrace the confidence intervals. They're very useful to convey your data in a better way that provides more information. I just want to share an inspiration that I had that kind of started the thoughts. I've expanded on some ideas, but this covers a lot more on other things, like simulations, for example. It's the book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas W. Hubbard. So really recommend it if you found this interesting. And this also talks about how to measure anything, like how to put numbers on things. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you found it interesting. And if you were to want to know more about this, don't hesitate to come up to me. That's it.